Hi, my name's Jason Barcham. I'm an associate partner with Servian, New Zealand. Welcome to the Technology Whisperers, a technology and innovation podcast brought to you by Servian with your hosts Alistair and Sean Muller. Join us as we demystify the latest emerging innovative technologies for businesses of all shapes and sizes, sharing our thoughts on how you can improve your current technologies, practices and processes to transform your business.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and good night. Wherever you are in the world, this is the Technology Whisperers with Sean G. Muller. Good day, Sean.
Good day, Alistair. How are you today?
I'm fine. And me, of course, Alistair Ross. Your two hosts here, the follically challenged wonders, as always, on our binary episode. We are all on. This is episode 11 of the Technology Whisperers. So what's been happening with you, Sean?
Work is going crazy. We've got a lot of stuff going on. The podcast has been hugely successful. We got lots of people reaching out to us, both interested in giving us topics. The list of topics we have is quite long, and we expect to have some new guest hosts or some new guests joining us in the coming weeks and months. So keep listening.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't see my face, but I was fist punching the air there when you were telling us all that. So that's really awesome news. I love to hear that. I love to hear and see how just engaged our listeners have become with the podcast. I'm really enjoying the interactive nature of it. So we've got people reaching out to us on LinkedIn and other methods as well. So if you, of course, I think I said this the last time when we were on the podcast, if you want to get involved with the podcast, if you've got suggestions, feedback, anything of that ilk, then please do get in touch. And I'll give you all of those methods of getting in touch with either Sean or myself at the end of the podcast. Now, I have been off. I've been off for the last couple of podcasts, and my apologies for that. I was with the dreaded lurgy. I had the COVID, and I think both of us now have had it, and it's hit us both quite hard. So It's not this 2 to 3 day thing like everybody else seems to get. It seemed to really hit us quite hard, which is just rubbish.
I don't think we're the spring chickens that some other people are, Alistair. I think you and I have been around the block quite a few times, and I think that caught up with us. But yes, we had a couple really good episodes, and we brought on a couple of really awesome guests. And in fact, we've now had Amanda on twice to talk about women in technology and women returning, people returning to technology after taking breaks. And both of those episodes actually have gotten really good numbers of people listening to them and really good reviews coming back to us.
That is awesome. Really, really cool to hear. All right. Well, without further ado, I think we better move on and introduce today's podcast. So as you may have known by listening to one of the earlier podcasts, I can't remember which number it was, maybe something like 2 or 3. It was one of the earlier podcasts that we did. We talked generally about security. This podcast today is on the topic of zero trust security. And I wanted to just roll through what zero trust is. You may have heard of it. And I think if I was in the position of CISO, CEO, CTO, that sort of person, I would be interested to know what zero trust security is all about, because it is becoming very important. And I would say, so it's definitely worthwhile tuning in if you don't know what zero trust is. And I think it's really worthwhile starting to think about adopt it if you're not already adopting it in your organization. So today's agenda, I'm going to run through what zero trust security is and why you should care. Zero trust is not a buzzword. I will talk about that, and how you can adopt a zero trust security model. And then, Sean, you've got a little bit about all of the bits and bobs that kind of talk to the technology, I guess. So I'll talk more abstracted, more high level, less tech, and then you've got more on the actual technologies which sit in the background of all of this. So in the technology future, micro-segmentation, software-defined networking, software-defined WANs, containerization, usage-based modeling of data access, all of that great stuff. So really, I think it's a real game of two halves we have lined up for you today. Some facts, first of all, and this is part of why you should care. So fact number one, and this is according to a 2018 study, a cost of data breach study. The average cost of a data breach is 3.86 million US dollars, with an average cost per lost record or stolen record of $148. So that's the Annabelle Graham IT Governance Audit 2018. And of course, that doesn't put into respect the cost of your reputational damage. That could be much wider. And it only takes a few headlines back to think about some very large organizations in New Zealand that have been affected by ransomware, by malware, and by all sorts of other wares in the last very recent history. So we have an audit-based and compliance aspect in the Privacy Act as well. The Privacy Act was, of course, updated in 2020 here in New Zealand, and there's a lot more that you have responsibility as an organization to report data breaches and data loss as well to the commission, to the government, and there are fines associated with that as well, of course. So it's really important that you do whatever you can do to protect your organization, not just for the good of your organization, but for your financial and reputational respects as well. Sean.
And yeah, well, and Alistair, I think it's worthwhile us noting that analysis of these data breaches. You highlighted the ransomware and phishing attacks and things like that we are seeing more and more and more. But the reality is that most of these large data breaches are caused by people internal within the organization doing something they're not supposed to. Either they're doing it maliciously or they're doing it accidentally. But it's not in the old days, it was a bad actor sitting out on the internet or dialing into your company. Now it's somebody sitting inside, and this is where this idea of zero trust comes in, is that rather than just blocking the bad actors that are outside, you're protecting the assets within the organization. And I know you're going to cover that in a minute, but I wanted to highlight this because when a lot of times when executives hear data breach, what they're thinking is bad actor sitting outside. But the reality is that most of these surveys are now coming back and showing that it was actually somebody internal. And if they had security controls inside the organization, at the data level, at the access level into individual systems internally within the system, within the organization, they would have reduced these or even eliminated them.
Absolutely. That dovetails very, very well into my next fact. So these are like pre-facts before I get into the meat of it. And so this fact is really important. So if you haven't updated your IT security policy, the likelihood of you still using standard usernames or passwords, or even slightly advanced from that, the single sign-on technology, bear in mind that they do not necessarily reveal that a user's details have been compromised or a device has been stolen. So when your security team or your network team or your SOC is looking through all the logs and so forth, if they see Bob logging in, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually Bob logging in. They'll just see it as Bob logging in. But Bob could have had his laptop stolen. He could have had some malware, ransomware, other software, some hacker on his system pretending to be Bob. And realistically, unless the activity looks a bit off, you're going to be none the wiser that system has actually been compromised. So this is where all of this zero trust really comes in. So what is zero trust and why should you care? Now, zero trust is actually not that new a thing. It's just that it's being talked about an awful lot more these days. And zero trust, like Sean says, is something that's really, really become very important today because of the types of services that we consume and from where the entry point of the attacks are actually happening. They're happening within the network, not outside. So if we think about the way that we secured our networks traditionally, and that's even going on to this very day, that a lot of the security products out there still kind of work on this model. They work on a model that I would call the castle and moat style. We trust everything inside our castle, everything inside our network, and everything after the moat or in the moat to a lesser extent, i.e. the DMZ, That's untrusted. We say all that stuff on the internet, all the stuff out there outside of our castle, that's bad, or it could potentially be bad. We better put up this big firewall and protect all of that
And
sort of stuff.
and
Yeah.
and generally there's one gate in and out, a choke point, and we do all of our security controls at that choke point.
Mm. Yeah.
And that is problematic. And yeah.
Yep. So that model there, the castle and moat, as I call it, it was a decent model when all of our infrastructure was based on our own physical networks in our own server rooms. So really, if we think about the cloud's been around for like properly for 15 years now. And when we were running our server rooms and all the rest of little server rooms, maybe even we were co-locating to another data center by some other company, but effectively it was still like our own equipment, right? That was a reasonable model for those sorts of days, but it hasn't really been a reasonable model since at least we went to the cloud, but probably even further than that. So zero
Probably a
trust.
little, yeah, probably a little before.
Yeah.
As we began offering internet services, and people were building more and more internet connections and offering more services, I really think, and consuming more services on the internet. So as we opened it up to people internal to our networks, accessing things that were out on the internet, like
Yeah.
being able to go and buy stuff or browse websites.
Yeah,
Really, this
I kind
model,
of think about it as the timeline of when zero trust really became very important would be around the time of the iPhone, right? It's
yep,
when the
yeah,
iPhone started to become prevalent, right? So the iPhone came out in 2007 now.
yep,
So like
yep,
you said at the beginning about how we are not as young, we're not as spring chickens as we are. I mean, I remember when the iPhone
yeah,
came out, right? And
yeah.
it is most definitely something which is not new. And in fact, the terminology or the term zero trust or it's a lot harder to say, perimiterless security model. That the zero trust model was coined by a fellow Scotsman, and he was a professor in Stirling University, and I think it was the mid 90s. I think it was 1994. So if you're hearing buzzwords and you're hearing people in the security market at the moment talk about whoa, this zero trust thing, blah blah blah, and it making it all sound like it's this new fancy thing, it's actually not. It's been around since
Right.
at least the mid 90s as being coined, and it's probably been around as a concept even before then.
Well,
So
yeah,
anyway, sorry.
we actually tried to. I was going to say, even when we were on premise, so back in the 90s and early 2000s, I was doing network engineering and network architecture, and we were trying to. We did try several times to implement what was borderline zero trust networking. Essentially, we placed firewalls at the gateway of every network segment, and the reality was is that most of the applications that had been developed around this idea that they could talk to everything and do everything they wanted to, and they didn't work properly through a firewall. So in the probably the noughties, as you refer to them, the early 2000s, the noughties, we began backing off of the idea of a firewall at each gateway because the applications just wouldn't work properly.
Yeah, that's right. So it was a decent infrastructure model to have that castle and moat, the big firewall, big chunky firewall, looking at all of the traffic, even doing intrusion protection, intrusion detection systems
Yep.
on top of that as well. That was fine for when we had the physical networks in our own server rooms, running our own software where we had the physical CDs for. But as the time went on, and the software that we started to consume and the services that we started to consume were all on the internet. All of the software really these days, if you think about half of the stuff at least that you use is all SaaS based. And how many pieces of software that you use today is in a web browser? Like
Right.
I don't actually have any software running apart from I use Adobe Premiere Pro, which is hooked up to the cloud anyway. But like that's the only old school kind of fat application that I run, and that's for editing videos, which kind of has to run locally. But if you think about it, all of the other software, and even that to some extent, all talks on the internet, all has a call home at least. But
Oh
even
yeah.
but Microsoft Office 365, you think of it as like still this old word processor that kind of sits on your PC, but actually by default, I think now all of the words that you type in your keyboard automatically go back to Microsoft or Microsoft's partner services, and they get checked for validity, the grammar checking and all that sort of stuff. So it's all actually online, and it's
Oh yeah.
crazy. So you think about it, even the most benign sort of looking
Well, even the
traditional
operating
app.
systems, even the
Yes.
operating systems, right? So Windows, if you're running Windows 11
Or
and you
10, even
boot up,
10.
even 10, and you boot up, the first thing it does is it tries to go out and check to see that you have a valid subscription to be running it,
Yep.
and to see if there are updates. And it'll run with no network connection. But I mean, phones, we've gotten so used to phones being constantly connected that we've just now accepted that any
Mm.
device is constantly connected to the internet. The danger with that is that it's constantly connected to the internet.
Yeah, and I think that ubiquity, that the good thing about the ubiquity or the pervasiveness of these internet connected devices, whether they be laptops, mobile phones, or even servers, is the instant on availability of
Yeah,
information, right? That's the convenience factor. That's why it's so useful. The telemetry that the devices provide and get back all the time. I mean, I know I can tell you right now where the closest chip shop is to me, and
yep,
what time it's open at, and what how many ratings out of 5 it's got, and all the rest. I can tell you within split second that. But that is it's a double-edged sword, right? It has its
that's right.
good sides and its bad side. And the bad side is that having that always connected access to information has that downside where the data could be intercepted and be used against your network. So
Right.
today we can't trust the stuff on our network at any point. We can't trust it internally. We can't obviously trust it externally or on our demilitarized zone, that kind of middle ground, that place between the internet and our own network. So thus a perimeterless network. I don't know why I can't say that. It's like purple burglar. What's it? Purple burglar alarm. Our Scottish people can't say that apparently, and I've just proven it again. So anyway, this
You should say Castle Wallace.
Castle Wallace.
So a castle with no walls.
Walls, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Wallace's castle. So the zero trust security model has started to become a really important and often talked about concept in the realms of security. And I think with the whole point of this podcast, as I always say every single week, is that this is all about taking all of that high tech talk that we talk about and really just boiling it down to its most basic, its most core principles, and seeing why it's an important thing that you actually need to be talking about. So I don't like to be talking about buzzwords on this podcast. That's not why we're here. We talk about what things are real, and so that's why I think that zero trust is an important aspect to talk about now. It's certainly topped the charts in terms of buzzwords in 2021 and 22.
And so we're going to jump in a little bit into, why it's not a buzzword and go into it. But I want to throw this out to you, Alistair. So is there an alternative? So is there a way to build a system for an organization that could still theoretically operate where everything goes through this choke point? Because I think we do see this in very limited use cases, like SCADA networks for power companies. So back-end control networks for power companies. I'm sure that the defense forces in every country have back-end networks. But I think from a business, they need to understand that there's a massive cost associated with trying to do that. And part of that cost is a lack of access to services. Because to do that, to your point, everything that people do on that network has to then be brought internally into the network. So no Office 365, very limited email, no access to music servers or video servers or crunching through numbers up in the cloud. It becomes a very expensive endeavor to build out all of that infrastructure to be able to accommodate doing all of their work internally without taking leveraged advantage of those SaaS network products.
That's exactly right. As the world moves forward, that with internet and SaaS-based technologies, the harder it is to actually make a reality where you're shutting all of that out. And yes, if your organization has any exposure to working with organizations in like defense contracts or so forth, you'll see that they still have rules that apply that way. I mean, you can't bring mobile phones
Oh
into
yeah,
the
or
workplace. Yeah, yeah, that sort of. So it is militant, and militant for good reason, right? That sort of level of defense is there for a reason.
yeah,
But the cost organizationally to have those levels of protection, it is possible, but the cost is extremely high. You have to have people physically policing that, and you
yep,
also have to have a security team constantly assessing what traffic is going through what network. So really, almost like having a tap watching the ones and zeros
yep, yeah,
through
yeah,
your network at all times. So it's not just a case of having a firewall put in place and blocking port X, Y, and Z. And it's not just the case of then adding an IPS and IDS on top of that. It's actually going to the next level and going right from the human perspective. Right, okay, the IDS hasn't flagged this, but is that legit? Should we
yep.
be having our own blacklists and whitelists in there? That sort of stuff.
It,
So
it
excluding domains and so forth.
and your organization is going to slow down because doing new things or doing things within the organization becomes exceptionally hampered. Scaling out what you're doing becomes very difficult. And we had a really good episode on technical debt. When you bring everything in house and don't leverage SaaS and cloud services, you are making a technical debt decision in such a way that you're going to have to plan for that, and it's going to be very costly. Uh, so all of that leads to the fact that, well, we don't want to do all that. How can we protect ourselves and not build this, you know, medieval castle choke point, bring everything inside the castle, try and do it, and that's when we get to this idea of zero trust.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and I think the thing about adopting a zero trust model is that it's not something that you're going to be able to do overnight. Now, the security companies out there, a lot of them, the ones that sell you firewalls, the ones that sell you traditional security products, they're going to tell you that just do the old castle moat thing and you'll be fine. They're still evolving. They're those ones because they're making so much money from their core security products. A lot of them, if you look at the Gartner quadrant, you'll find there's a lot of sort of not laggards, but companies in the middle there that are still pushing their old way of doing things. So that is a difficult aspect. You need to find people or organizations at the front end, the leading end of the Gartner quadrant that are really thinking about zero trust now. So first of all, finding a reputable, trusted partner, maybe consultants as well, and also the right products. But then it comes internal, right? So you can do all of that great stuff with partners and vendors and so forth, but realistically, it's a cultural shift, not just a technology shift. So
Yeah.
you're going to have to retrain. If you've got security people inside your organizations or even just your IT team, those people are going to have to be retrained on a zero trust methodology first. And so that is a cultural change. And then by proxy, because this affects everyone inside your organization, it doesn't just affect the IT people, it affects the way that you think about, your email. Phishing, right? Phishing is the obvious example, right? You get an email, it looks like it's legit, it comes from your boss, it says, hey, can you click on this link and go do
Oh,
whatever it is? And
it
next,
says no. It says, hey, can you go down to the the dairy and pick me up, $2,000 worth of Prezi cards,
yeah,
and then email me through the serial numbers off the back of them because I'm going to give them out to all the employees, and then you find out later it didn't come from your boss.
that's it. Yeah. So that is what's happening. So you can't just leave it to your IT team. You have to have your whole organization start to refocus their understanding on IT security. So if you as an organization are not having regular training, and by regular I mean at minimum quarterly, on how to protect your organization from security threats, then you are missing something. You really, really need to start thinking about the damage that could be done to your organization, not just financially, reputationally, and obviously from a government policy perspective as well. So it's a completely different world that we're operating in now to one that we were in just even 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. So there is a lot more at stake. So how do you adopt a security trust model, a zero trust model, I think is kind of where you're getting to there, Sean. So first of all, it may appear obvious or not, but assume that all activity on all of the networks in and out of your corporate network is untrusted until, and this is the important part, this is the sort of real clencher for zero trust, until, so like zero trust, I guess if you just take it by the name zero trust, you just don't trust anything. It's not entirely true. That's not the whole picture of the term zero trust. It's you trust nothing until the user and the device have been authenticated and authorized for that segment of the network. So then,
and let's go one step higher, because the networking people will get that completely. It's not trusted to access that service, that file, or that piece of data until they have been validated, the person, the device, and that they have authority to access it.
That's absolutely right. Perfect. That's really, really good. So yeah, so we're not just talking about, simple permissions here. If you think about the premise behind data leakage, right? You could have access to a network and, by intentionally, if you're a bad actor on your corporate network, which is still less of the case, or unintentionally, you might get phished or something might happen. Having that granular access to the network by adopting a zero trust model will or tries to make sure that data loss or data leakage is set at a level minimum. And that's because it goes, right, should Bob in development have access to the HR accounts? Who should that person be able to see salary level data and really classify the data within an organization? That sort of level of trust and granularity is really important. Obviously, making that sort of level of trust and granularity is not something that you can do overnight. It's not
Right.
something that you can just adopt and go, hey, we're zero trust now. It's something that will take some time. That culture shift and that also that the technology that needs to be in place, that is not something that's going to just happen within a month or two.
Yeah.
Stick a product in and you got it. It's not going to happen. So
Well, and the technical debt, right? So if you have a legacy technical debt that you haven't dealt with yet, oftentimes that technology won't accommodate you going to a zero trust model. So if the technology that you're using has services on it that you can't go to a granular level of control, then to fully adopt a zero trust model, you're going to have to look at upgrading that product.
absolutely, yeah. So another aspect as well is just talking about the legacy technology. The legacy technology in your network might still be quite acceptable. It's just that you might not be using it to its fullest extent. So you could be looking at your network administration, and this is an area that, again, from Sean, your background, and to a slightly lesser extent my background, we were both network admins, working on Cisco gear and stuff like that back in the day. All of these devices did things like AAA. We also did things like Radius, but we also did things like segmentation. So that's not new. There's nothing new in there. But if you look at a lot of corporate networks, you might find that the segmentation is quite lightweight. It really is like, wide open. You have one VLAN, for example, which kind of does all of your corporate office space. So literally there's no segmentation, say HR, finance, the developer staff and other staff. They're all in one big VLAN, right? That's, if you think about a zero trust model, having it better segmented to say, well, HR, is there any reason that they really need to be able to talk directly on the same kind of piece of wire, as it were, to the developers? Does HR need to physically talk to them over that same, or can they go through an outway, a gateway, and then into that network if they really genuinely have to have some sort of interaction with their network. So it's not that part itself is not new, but I think it's worthwhile bringing that up, that having your segmentation done a bit more granularly
thoughtfully.
Yeah. Now that itself, just by doing that, will reduce the blast radius on your network. So if you have something which happens in the developer network, say, somebody clicks on a bad link or something like that, and it, blows up and destroys the whole developer network, at least it's not going to go over to HR or accounts or management networks, because you have put in that that VLAN. And of course, the same sort of thing happens in the cloud now as well. We have VPCs, virtual private clouds. So you can segment off different technology stacks, different applications, whatever it might be, into separate VPCs. And that's quite normal within the cloud. I mean, when AWS, for example, started out, it wasn't the default to have VPCs, but I think these days it's quite standard that you set everything up and you put them in separate VPCs. So
I
Amazon.
remember we went through a time where different business divisions would have different VPCs, but I think most organizations that are mature in their cloud adoption are now going to services level VPCs. So all of the services associated with a particular application or business service are in a separate VPC. So you might have the accounting team might have a VPC for monthly accounts, and the yearly accounts might be significantly more application heavy, and they might have a completely different VPC for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is quite prevalent within the cloud world, especially in the last sort of, I would say, close to 10 years, but definitely in the last 5 years, for applications and cloud native technologies to be set up in separate VPCs. It is the default. It's not the, we need to set up a VPC afterthought. It's by default, you get a new VPC for every new thing that you set up in the cloud. So that's kind of baked in, and that's the same with Azure and for GCP as well. So that's a good thing, I guess. On to another aspect: adopt data leakage protection, inventory, and auditing software that ideally integrates or is part of your SIEM. So basically that just talks to that whole data leakage that I was talking about a moment ago, right? But to do proper data leakage protection, if you do not have an inventory of your network, then it's going to be really, really difficult to know if you've leaked data, if you've lost data. Where has it gone from? What devices did it go from? Okay, if you've got a host name of Bob Computer 123, that isn't really going to help you. You need a proper inventory and an audit of what those things are. They need to be monitored continually and sent back to your security incident event monitor, right? So all of that information needs to flow in there.
And it needs to do it automatically.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say. The automation aspect of that is very important, because doing a manual inventory, and this is like, some security firms will still recommend that you go off and do a manual inventory of all of your assets. The reality of doing that these days is almost futile, because we have not only our own assets in physical space, like our laptops and our mobile phones and all the rest, but how many rogue devices do you think you've got on your wireless network, for example? That alone is very difficult. But then extend it out into the cloud, right? Think about the pipeline, or the trail of information that goes on and on and on outside of your applications. So the SaaS nature of things that we have today, think about, or even Office 365. Just take Office 365, something that a lot of organizations have as a trusted application within their organization today. Well, first of all, your organization authenticates via probably Active Directory. So your usernames are uniquely tied into the cloud via Azure AD, and they are all authenticated into Office 365 via that method. And then Office 365 itself, they have other trusted partners. Microsoft have trusted partners that the information, like I was talking about that grammar and spell checker example, those, I mean, that's a hypothetical, but it doesn't matter. Realistically, there is a vendor chain of SaaS products. It's not just going to Microsoft.com, it's going to a whole bunch of other domains and services across the internet, or it's using other services on their network. Regardless, there is information spilling out all over the place. So auditing these things by hand is pretty much impossible. So that's
Yeah.
why automation is so key to as part of that process. So yeah, definitely. On top of that, think about your SOC, your security operations center. These people within this team, if they're going to get this massive host of alerts coming through about, oh, this is happening and this is happening, this is happening, every time the logs from particular servers come through, they're going to see a lot of these either false positives or sort of semi-true alerts, which are actually fairly benign. So you need to have a method of reducing what I would call alert burnout. So actually giving things that matter, that rise to the top of the alerts for your SOCs to actually deal with.
So this is something I want to touch on a little bit because it's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. Being able to identify this, so back in the day, I worked on a open source project called Base. Give a shout out to Kevin Johnson there. And the idea of Base was to take those alerts and look for a root cause analysis from a security perspective, and to identify so that the alert going to the SOC was the most likely root cause. So it reduced it. You didn't have to go through all the log entries, all the alerts, all the alarms to be able to identify it. Today, what's happening with a lot of organizations is that rather than trying to adopt automated technologies to be able to do this, what they're doing is they're pre-filtering all of the alerts going into their SIEM or their SOC so that they're only getting the alerts that they have already identified things they need to do with. Now, the problem with that is they only ever see the things that they already know about, and security is all about the things you don't know about. So all of those log events that they have no idea what they are or what the event was never make it into the SOC or SIEM. There's no way to report on it. In fact, there's no even way to go backwards and see what happened after you realize something bad has happened. It really has to be within the SOC and SIEM, an automated way to be able to chase that root cause in a way that gives the root cause alert, or at least an identification of where the root cause alert most likely came from to the SOC operators, rather than trying to pre-filter the alerts coming to the SIEM.
That is a fantastic real world example, and that is very true. So I mean, like, there's a lot of atrophying and going on. It's very difficult to strike that balance, but I think it is a necessary to strike that balance. And it's something that a CISO should be very mindful of. So your CISO really, if you're a good CISO, you should be talking to your security operations center, your team there, and saying, "Hey, how are you viewing your logs? What are you discarding? What are your false positives? How many false positives have you got? Are you burning out on all of these logs? And how can we sort that? What technologies can we adopt to actually make sure that we're actually zeroing in on what real potential threats that there are on our network?" Whenever you start up a new SOC solution or SOC CM solution, you're going to have a lot of red lights, right? That's a given, right? And taking that down to a day where the security person's nirvana, where you see all green lights, is almost never going to happen. But to have a few green lights, a few amber lights, and just maybe one or two red lights, that's where you want to be. But in order to do that, you've got to have a very, very good way of basically understanding what false positives are and really identifying them properly.
And if you're struggling, like look, Alistair and I are aware of this acutely in New Zealand, but it's happening in all across the world, Asia, Europe, the Americas. There is a shortage of security operators because the reality is that in the old days you would just say, well, we'll just hire more security operators to be able to cover off all the alerts and chase all of them out. It's not happening. I think we did an episode on AI ops, and we touched a little bit on AI SecOps. We might do a podcast episode if somebody's interested. And if somebody out there is an expert in it would like to come along and talk about AI SecOps and what it is, we'd love to have you on. But
Yeah,
I think we
yeah.
need to do a deep dive because uh, security operations is even worse off than regular IT operations. I mean, regular IT operations, you can find people that want to go into that. There are so few people that actually know security and can do security operations that without these tools to automate some of the, it's just you're never going to catch up with everything.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And the fact is that you could be looking for needles in haystacks a lot of the time. Really, really difficult world. So yeah, that would be a great opportunity, I think, if you do have AI SecOps experience and understand automation of those particular of security aspects, then we'd love to hear from you. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to leave this particular aspect on, but just as a reminder, I think overall the most important thing is, again, just reiterating the fact of training all your staff about adopting that culture of zero trust. You have to give briefings where you probably provide phishing examples of phishing attacks, large scale data breaches, and so forth. In my previous company, there's a whole bunch of companies out there right now that are doing sort of animated videos, and sort of some of them have got like Hollywood actors and stuff like that. So little videos, they get sent to you via email, and they're just sort of like 5-minute training videos to sort of tell you, hey, this is what security is. So it's actually in fun and engaging for people who are doing real jobs and not geeks. And so that's pretty cool. But on top of that, what they also do as well is they have little gotchas. So they'll send phishing attacks, fake phishing attacks, pretending to be from reputable brands in your country that So it's quite common for people to click on links from banks and so forth. So they'll pretend to be a bank that you might bank with. You press on the link and then it goes, sorry, you failed this particular test, but thank God it wasn't a real phishing attack. It was just us trying to see who needs more training. And that goes back to the CISO or the organization to say, hey, these people have failed the phishing attack test. By the way, you might want to train them up a bit more. So those things are, I would say, if you're taking security seriously, having these routine training sessions and tests almost is a really valuable thing to do, and will really reduce your risks of exposure. So definitely give them a consideration as well. Sean, so we've really kind of talked about the theory and the reasons why that you would want to go into adopting a zero trust level of security and adopting that culture. But maybe we could dive just a little bit into the areas of technology that exist around zero trust. And so you've got a few areas that you wanted to discuss today. Well,
Yeah, I
could you
think
introduce?
well, yeah. So we started diving down into a couple of these, and what it is that, again, this podcast is about demystifying, both for the business side, but also for the technology side, to be able to talk to the business, right? So if the business has been listening to us up till now, and they feel like that they can go and talk with the technology teams about what zero trust is and what they're aiming for, it'd be good. Oftentimes they go in and they go, yeah, we need to be doing zero trust, and that means we need to have VPCs. And the technology team says, well, we have VPCs. And what ultimately happened is that because the business is asking for a zero trust implementation, or they want to know they're moving towards a zero trust stance or footing within the organization. But what they've said to the technology teams is, yeah, VPCs, the technology teams don't understand what they're asking about. So I want to take it down a level so that the business can understand what we're talking about with some of these technologies, but also so those of you that are technology people can better understand what the business is expecting to hear, and what the business is expecting, or they need to understand about the things you're doing. So we're going to touch on a couple different technologies real quick. I don't expect to go. This is not a deep technical episode. I just want to touch on them and talk about some of the use cases and things they solve. The first of those is microsegmentation. Now, we've been talking about, in fact, Alistair, in this podcast and I have talked about what microsegmentation might look like. But when we mentioned it, we talked about creating gateways between things. In a perfect world, every device attached to a network would have its own gateway and would be security audited every time it talked across that gateway, so that nobody did anything onto the network that they weren't supposed to be doing. That's a perfect world. That's perfect microsegmentation. It's almost impossible to achieve. So we begin to break things apart in microsegmentation, and we say that the user community or user computers that's this entire grouping. So all of the computers that are end users, the developers, the HR team, the accounting team, the salespeople, all of them sit over in this other area, and we're moving towards a model where basically all those devices are just sitting on the internet. The services they're accessing are what we're talking about segmenting off. So all of the cloud services, all the SaaS services, even any on-premise services are segmented away from those user computers in such a way that we can control them. Within those spaces, we then segment them down as much as we can with still allowing the applications to work. So we don't have, the accounting software sitting on the same segment with the sales CRM software, because if one of them gets compromised, you've compromised both of them. So segmenting it down and making to Alistair's point, the blast radius, of the compromised system as little as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Today, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, today, oftentimes what we're talking about is a software-defined network, because it's no longer we have the gateway is this cable that's plugged into a firewall someplace. It's some of the applications are containers, some of the applications are virtual machines, and the network, the gateway for the network to the internet is oftentimes a completely software-controlled gateway that sits in the cloud. So you can actually, especially with containerization, you can actually shrink that microsegmentation down to, well, this container is allowed to talk to these 3 other containers, but if it wants to talk to any other containers, it has to go through a gateway. And that's a software-defined network. So we can use SDN gateways, the gateways associated with software-defined networks, to drill all the way down to a single application on a server, or with a service within a server, or a container, and we can limit the traffic to and from that service or application all the way down to, this service does DNS, this service hosts a website, this is a call to a database service, and we can segment it all the way down. And so when we talk about microsegmentation and where SDN is at, that's what we're talking about. So we've kind of talked about what SDN's bias and what microsegmentation's bias, but you're going to hear the term SD-WAN, and especially around security and segmentation, SD-WAN becomes really important. So we talked about those user computers, all of the people that do work in your business, and how they connect into those back-end services. So there are 2 main ways that we can do this. The first way is that we can just open up the services to the internet. But as we said, if we segment it down and say, hey, we don't want our accounting software to be internet accessible, as an example. So somehow we have to limit who's allowed to access that. Now, we could build a VPN. We could run a dedicated telephone circuit to it, but it's very costly and doesn't scale very well. Or we could use software-defined wide area networks to build a back-end security structure that allows only designated devices that are on the internet, connected to the internet, to be able to access those services across that microsegmentation. So SD-WAN allows you to limit, and again, zero trust is about limiting access to authenticated, validated, verified devices and people. And so SD-WAN becomes a key technology component in being able to do that. We touched on containerization. The interesting thing is that we're now moving within the services, and especially around containers, to this idea. And I remember in the early 2000s, the first time I heard about heuristics. And if you think back, Alistair, there was Cisco had a product in the early 2000s that they had a Windows 95 machine that they put up on the internet with this heuristic-based virus software on it and it had no patches on it, and they had an open bounty for any hackers to hack into this Windows 95 box. And I believe it ran for 2 years without anybody breaking into it. So if you hear the term heuristics and you're talking with your virus software people, or you're talking with your security firewall people, and they're talking about heuristics basically is, this machine does these things, and 5 days from now it does something that it's never done before.
Yeah. So it's like a fingerprint almost, isn't it? It's like
Yes.
This is the fingerprint of what it's typical to look like. And if that fingerprint has changed, then there's a potential that that's been compromised in some way.
Yeah, it's doing something it shouldn't be. Traditionally, the ones that we saw were suddenly your accounting server on premise began hosting a website. It's never hosted a website before. Suddenly it's hosting a website. That's generally a bad thing. Heuristics are not perfect, especially if you have something that runs quarterly or once a year. A heuristic fingerprint that's been done on day-to-day usages, every time that quarterly job runs, the heuristics doesn't realize that that's a legitimate thing, and so you get a false positive. So heuristics is not a magic bullet, but it becomes a part of a zero trust environment that you're looking at it. And by the way, the Microsoft security services use heuristics to be able to identify when the functionality of things change. Cisco's has matured their virus product. So it's now it's an application that runs on your desktops that does heuristics-based anomaly detection on those desktops. So if suddenly your personal laptop begins hosting a Microsoft SQL database and just feeding data out to the internet, and it's never done that before, it kicks back and says, well, this isn't supposed to be doing this.
Very good. Yes.
So we've talked to most of the things we're talking about are networks and how networks to solve this, but I've got some bad news for you. So zero trust is not about solving everything using the network. Zero trust is about taking that authentication and that role-based access to the application and even to the data. So nowadays, when we talk about zero trust, and if you're in a modern zero trust stance, you may open up the application to the internet, but you may limit who can access what data on the application down to only authenticated and authorized people. So you may want to say, yeah, this one client of mine can look at their invoice and the state of the shipment of their order to them, but they can't query it for their neighbor's business. And that's not done at the network level. It may not even be done at the application level. It may actually be done at the data level. So now we're looking at cloud data services where we're actually doing authentication at an individual piece of data or an individual. Ooh, that's a hard word for an American to say. A file or piece of information, so that the service allows access to it. But as soon as you try and access that file or that piece of data, it authorizes you to do it. And if you don't have authorization, you can't do it. So again, back to that idea of zero trust that Alistair was talking about. You're untrusted until you're verified, both your device and you, that you're allowed to access the data, the application, the service, and the computer.
Yep. That is zero trust. It's quite the hefty topic. It's not something that can be adopted in one little day. It's definitely something that will take some considerable thought for your organization, and it's not something that can be done with just one simple tool or product. It's a multidiscipline thing which spans different network technologies and different application technologies as well.
Yes.
So definitely, hopefully what we've done in this episode is given you a good bit of food for thought about what the concept of zero trust is, why it is actually really, really relevant today, and why, if your organization is still just using usernames, passwords, maybe a little bit of SSO, and then sticking a firewall at the edge of your network and saying that's it, job's done, that you're what I would say is probably your organization is at risk, or at significant risk of having some sort of compromise in the very near future. And so you should be considering adopting a zero trust model. So that's hopefully what the messages of today's podcast is trying to get across, the different profiles of risk to your organization, and why zero trust is the appropriate method to consider when looking at securing your network in the near future.
And for the business side, if we're looking at business cases and the cost to adopt it, we don't want to scare you. You can iterate your way into this. This is not oh, you have to do everything on day one or you can't do anything. If you have a security roadmap to begin the process of heading towards zero trust, you can take advantage of a lot of the technologies and capabilities to get better and better and better. And their value at every step of the path. So my recommendation would be, if your CISO is interested, that you have professional services companies that you work with, you have consultants, it's worth having a discussion with them about building a roadmap of how you might get to zero trust, because you're going to need it in the coming years.
Indeed. All right. Well, I hope you have enjoyed our podcast for today. If you have any feedback, of course, we would love to hear from you as usual. And if you've got any ideas for future podcasts, again, please do let us know. And so how do we get in touch with yourself there, Sean?
Well, so it's interesting, Alistair. You and I were talking about this the other day, and we were putting together that list of contacts, and I suddenly realized that. So if you search for Sean G. Muller, so SeanGMuller, on pretty much any of, even Discord and Clubhouse came up when we were having the discussion. But
Scary.
Yes, I know. But you can find me on the Instagrams, the Twitters, the Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn, or you can just email me at sean.muller@servian.com.
Yep. Yeah, even Discord. And that would be interesting to have real-time chats with you.
Yeah.
So Sean G. Muller #1887. I'm assuming you weren't born in 1887. I mean, I know that we're getting on a bit.
I'm old,
but really,
yes, but
that's taking it back to abacus days. That's
well, this is one of those things that so I'm going to put this out here because Alistair and I have talked about doing this and we haven't done it. So maybe if you're listening to this and it sounds like something you'd be interested in, we might do a Discord or a Clubhouse channel, test it out, see if people would like to get on and talk with us. Because that allows, one of the things that Alistair and I miss is that two-way conversation. We love doing these podcasts, but we also like talking with people and getting feedback while we're doing it. So maybe if our listeners would be interested in a Clubhouse channel, we could establish a Clubhouse channel and try it once to see if it makes sense. So let us know.
Yeah, I mean, you can probably tell when you listen to the podcast as well that it's fairly free form. Like we don't edit much or any of the content that we do. We kind of just riff a lot of the stuff off. So it's very conversational in nature in any case. So it really I think it would always add to the conversation to have people along to the podcast. So it would definitely be great. If you want to get in touch with myself as well, I'm not as prevalent on the internet as Sean, but you can get me on, always near and dear to my heart, Sean. LinkedIn.com/in/Alistair J. Ross. That's ALISTAIR J. Ross, ROSS. And you can email me, alistair.ross@servian.com. And you can also check me out on my YouTube channel. I do something completely different on YouTube. I kind of mainly play around with retro computers. So like the people who play with old cars and fix them up and make them all work and stuff like that. Well, I do the same, but for retro hardware and retro software. And well, there's a few IT security stuff things on there as well, but the mainstay of it is old computer software, old computer games, and old computer hardware. So you can check me out at youtube.com/Al's Geek Lab. So that's it for today's podcast. That's number 11 in the can. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll speak to you again really soon in episode 12. Until then, take care and be excellent to each other.